Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Edelstein, who has spoken to us many times, and not for a while, but we were lucky in getting him back. And to my mind, what he's talking about, rational emotive behavior therapy, I feel is really at the core of humanism. How does a humanist deal with the world and with their own frustrations and their interactions with other people? And Michael is very good at putting that out there in a simple way that we can take, although all of us who've tried to change bad traits we've been having realize it doesn't happen magically and overnight. I think I'll let it go at that and let Michael, Dr. Edelstein, come and produce and be prepared to ask good questions. Thank you. Let's give him a good hand.
There you go. Okay, thanks, Art, for that great introduction. I always look forward to speaking here, mainly because of the interesting, challenging questions I get from the audience. So don't hold back, and feel free to raise your hand at any time and ask a question. To add to the introduction, I just want to mention that since I've been here, I also have come out with 3 more books in addition to my 3-minute therapy book. One is Rational Drinking, How to Live Happily with or Without Alcohol. Also Stage Fright, about overcoming performance anxiety, and my most recent book is Therapy Breakthrough, a history of the psychotherapy movement from Sigmund Freud to Albert Ellis in the present. A little background about myself. When I was 18 years old, I was depressed most of the time, anxious the rest of the time, with thoughts of suicide. So I entered into therapy with a psychoanalytically oriented therapist. And it was a nice, pleasant, safe experience, because every week I'd have a session with him and I'd tell him about all my criminal behavior during the week, why I was such a horrible person, and he would be very accepting and listen and nod his head, never criticize me, and mainly say, tell me more about that. So at the end of a year, I figured I'm not getting anywhere, and I heard about this person named Albert Ellis, and he was giving a talk in New York, where I was living at the time. I went to his talk, and he didn't hold back on criticisms of psychoanalysis, Freud, and traditional therapy, and just about everything he said resonated with me, so I immediately switched to Albert Ellis and saw him for 5.5 years. I was a difficult customer. In fact, after 5.5 years of therapy with him, he said, "You got worse." That was a joke. Last time I said this in an audience, someone raised the question, if you got worse, why are you giving us a talk on this? So I want to assure you that was a joke. Now, Albert Ellis in the 50s devised a new approach to therapy called REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. Anyone here familiar with Albert Ellis or REBT? Okay, good. A sizable minority. And since then, since the 50s, when Albert Ellis came up with this approach, it has since spawned a variety of cognitive behavior therapies, which is a term you might be more familiar with since then. But it all goes back to Dr. Ellis's original works. Since then, he's written over 80 books on the subject. So if you do a search on Albert Ellis, you'll see talks by him, and you could get many books that he's written. The fundamental idea in REBT and cognitive behavior therapy comes from the Roman philosopher Epictetus, and he was of the Stoic school, and he said, it's never events themselves that can upset us, but rather it's always our thinking, our views about those events which cause our emotional disturbance. And that's a very powerful idea, because if it's your ideas in your head, your beliefs, what you're telling yourself that causes your emotions and self-destructive behavior, then you can change your thinking if it's not working for you and develop a new perspective. And we'll be discussing that. Now, as it says in this little précis you have here, that the main psychological block to happiness and meaning consists of these irrational, unrealistic, unreasonable types of thinking. So I'm going to show you how to get over that and then give you some hints on developing happiness and meaning in your life once you do that. Now, some of the main symptoms of thinking unrealistically and irrationally in the psychological realm are emotions like anxiety, depression, anger, guilt, shame, embarrassment, and self-destructive behaviors such as procrastination and addictions. Is there anyone here who has not suffered from any of those emotions or behaviors? Okay, one person has not. I think there's might be one liar in the audience. So these ideas would apply to all of you. Now, what I'd like to do is first state the lesson, happiness and meaninglessness in one lesson, and meaningfulness in one lesson, and then show you how you can apply it to these different areas. I got this idea of making this presentation in this manner from a seminal book on economics called Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. Anyone familiar with that book? And what he does is, in the first chapter, he states a general economic lesson or theory, and then in the rest of the chapters, he applies it to different areas of our economic life. So that's what I'd like to do. And the lesson in one sentence is abolish, get rid of, disabuse yourself of all demands, all absolutes, all musts, shoulds, supposed tos, have tos, oughts, any thinking like that that leads to emotional or behavioral disturbance is irrational, unempirical, it doesn't follow logically, and it's unpragmatic, it doesn't work. Otherwise, it's a great way to look at things. Now, demands, musts, and shoulds generally have two main areas of thought in our life, and the first is a demand on oneself, and that takes the form of, because I strongly prefer to do well and get approval, therefore I absolutely must, I have to achieve and not be disapproved of, and if I am criticized or if I do fail, then I'm no good, I'm a worthless person, I'm a total loser. And that kind of thinking, a demand on oneself, leads to anxiety, depression, shame, embarrassment, and guilt. Anyone recognize thinking in that way? I must do well and get approval, and if I don't, I'm no good. Okay, many of you have, and I would make the case that most humans in all cultures throughout history tend to take their reasonable preferences, I prefer to do well and get approval, and escalate them into demands, musts and shoulds. So you're in good company. The second area of demands is a demand on others, and that takes the form of, because I prefer you treat me reasonably, courteously, lovingly, reciprocally, fairly, therefore you absolutely must treat me that way, and if you don't, then you're no good, you're a rotten person, and you deserve to roast in hell, and I've just appointed myself as your roaster. And that leads to anger, resentment, hostility, vengeance, homicide. And that demand, that must, again, is irrational. It doesn't work. It just leads to these disturbed emotions, and it generally doesn't help you achieve your goals with other people. Then the final demand people tend to have is on impersonal conditions of one's life, not on people, oneself or others, but rather on situations, on the world, and that takes the form of, because I strongly prefer life to be fair, easy, and hassle-free, therefore it absolutely must be that way, because I run the universe, of course, and it's awful, terrible, horrible, I can't stand it, I'll be miserable forever if things or my feelings are not the way I think they must be. And that leads to various behavioral problems such as procrastination, addictions to drugs, alcohol, food, cigarettes, gambling, anything that's pleasurable in life, people find a way to make into an addiction, or at least some people, by convincing themselves they must feel good, they must escape frustration, so they'll escape into this pleasurable activity. So those are the three musts. So the main way to apply the lesson, to get rid of your musts, abolish all your demands, is whenever you notice you're feeling emotionally disturbed, anxious, depressed, or angry, or you notice you're acting self-destructively, look for the must, look for the should. Cherchez le must, cherchez le should. And then question it, challenge it, confront it, and contradict it. Again and again and again and again. Any questions about the lesson? That's the lesson. That'll cure you forever if you practice it and reinforce it and change your thinking. Yes? Yep. Excuse me, wait for the mic.
Did I hear you correctly? If you're feeling pleasure doing one thing and you're not feeling pleasure doing another thing, then you should not think that you should do the thing. Then you should not do what you think is pleasurable? That's what it sounds like. Why is there not a should when an organism comes up to a situation in which doing one thing is pleasurable and doing another is not?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part. Why is there not a should?
You're saying one should not go towards the pleasure.
Right. Okay, the question, if I understand it, is I'm saying one should not go toward the pleasure, but in your ranking of values, shouldn't you go toward the higher pleasure? Is that it? Okay. Well, the first point is I'm not making the case that you should not do anything. I'm making the case abolish all your shoulds or musts. And once you do that, then you'll have a hierarchy of preferences, and then it would be better, it would be preferable to act on your higher preference, because presumably that will give you more advantages and fewer disadvantages than acting on a lower preference. And then acting on a lower preference often is considered procrastination, because you're putting off what it would be better to do in order to do what it would be less good to do. And just to make it less abstract, for example, let's suppose that it's time to wash the dishes, and you do have a preference to get the dishes out of the way, but so it would be better to do that then do your lower preference, which is call a friend. But then if you act on your lower preference and call a friend rather than acting on your higher preference to wash the dishes immediately, then you're acting in a self-destructive way. And normally the reason people act on lower preferences rather than higher preferences is because they escalate their lower preference. I prefer to call my friend into a must, into a demand. I absolutely have to right now. It's the end of the world if I face the dishes and don't speak to my friend. So then they act on a lower value, because when you take a preference and make it into a demand, then it has the weight of an nth degree preference and it'll outweigh all better actions, more self-fulfilling actions. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Would it be another way to look at it would be to say turn your shoulds into wants? I should do the dishes, brother. I want to do the dishes. And so it's less oppressive on your mind. I mean, if you want the cookie versus you should have the cookie. If you want the cookie, you don't get it, you're fine. If you should have the cookie and you don't get it, then you're somehow a lesser individual.
Okay, that's an excellent question, and that is, would you be better off turning your shoulds and musts into preferences, into wants, into desires? Yes, that's really the lesson, so thanks for restating it. Get rid of all musts and shoulds. There are none. They're fictions like Santa Claus. When you were 3 or 4 years old, you might have gotten rid of your belief in Santa Claus or God or other fictions. So the last fiction that people believe is the fiction that thinking because certain things are preferable, therefore they have to be. And the reason it's a fiction is that if we ask for the evidence for the must, if we ask for the evidence for the should, normally there is no evidence. Now, a word about what we mean in REBT by a must or a should. The first thing to note is that in different disciplines, different words often have different meanings. And this is what some people confuse about REBT. For example, let's take the word apple. Now, if I try to take a bite of my Apple computer, not only will I be very disappointed, but I might lose a tooth or two because I've confused the meaning of apple from a different area of discourse. On the other hand, if I talk into my Macintosh Apple and I expect Siri to respond, again, I'm going to be highly disappointed. So apple in one area means something very different than an apple in another area of discourse. Or let's take the word interest. In economics and finance, the word interest has one meaning, and in social psychology, interest has an entirely different meaning, being interested in a person rather than how much money is going to accrue to your savings every year. So that is a lesson for thinking about musts and shoulds as we use it in REBT, and the way we use it is in a psychopathological sense. The must or should we're talking about, it leads to emotional disturbance. Now, there are various other musts in other areas of discourse. For example, I could say, if I want to get to the Humanist Forum by 11, I must or I should leave my apartment in San Francisco at 10. So that's a conditional must, an if-then must, if X, then Y. So that's not the kind of must we're talking about. That must is fine in logic. Or there's also a must of prediction. The sun must rise at 7:03 a.m. tomorrow. So I'm predicting the sun will rise based on history. So that's also a different kind of must, not a psychopathological or global must. I have no problem with that. So there are other meanings for must, so trying to separate those, what we're talking about is these musts that lead to emotional behavioral disturbance. And also another characteristic of this type of must is when you start with the must, it ends with global evaluations. I must do well and get approval, otherwise I'm a worthless person. So I'm evaluating my total self. That's a global evaluation. Or you must treat me well, and if you don't, you're no good. Another global evaluation. Or if life isn't fair, easy, and hassle-free, all of life is horrible. Now again, these conclusions, just as the first clause, is global and therefore irrational. There are no bad, worthless people. There are just us imperfect humans who act imperfectly. Some of us act more imperfectly than others. Some of us are very talented at acting imperfectly, like mass murderers. But basically, our essence, our humanity is imperfect humans who act imperfectly. And same with life. Life can't be all bad, 100% bad. It can be very, very bad, so bad it might be a rational decision to commit suicide because the disadvantages of living greatly outweigh the advantages, but we could always think of advantages. For example, to take an extreme case, if you've been tortured for the last month, that's very, very, very bad, but it could always be worse. You could have been tortured for the last 2 months or the last 6 months. So hypothetically, nothing is all bad. So these global evaluations don't make sense and just lead to emotional disturbance. So there's these reality musts, and then there's psychopathological musts. When I use must, should, supposed to, have to, got to, I'm just referring to the psychopathological musts. And in order not to confuse things, if I talk about prediction or the way things are, I try to say preference rather than a must or a should or a need. Any questions about how we're defining must in REBT? Yes? Do you have a question? Yeah. All right, Mike, get the microphone.
I was wondering if this system works for people who constantly procrastinate, because it seems rational, and I've tried it on myself, that when I procrastinate, I worry all the time about the coming deadline, but find a way to lose time. Now, I don't know if this is part of aging, but anyway, that's beside the point. Not knowing what time it is 30 minutes later, an hour later, oh my goodness. But can this be used for that, to reason your way out of procrastination?
Yeah, thank you for that question. In fact, I was going to ask about specific issues you think this might be applied to, and you raised one, procrastination. And the answer is yes, this very definitely can be applied to procrastination. Now, normally procrastination means delay. You delay on some action, behavior, activity. Now, sometimes it's useful to delay because, as we were saying earlier, you have a hierarchy of preferences, what to do now, what to do in an hour, etc. And there are competing preferences, so when you make a decision, I'm going to do A rather than B and C, you're really delaying or procrastinating doing B and C. But that would be reasonable unless you figure out a way to do A, B, and C all at the same time, which is usually unlikely. So some procrastination is okay, but generally when I use the term procrastination, I'm talking about unreasonable procrastination, as in the example I gave on doing the dishes. So normally when people procrastinate, they have a preference. I prefer to feel comfortable right now, or I prefer not to face difficulty, and the task at hand is not going to be comfortable. It might be boring or difficult. I don't know what the best first step is, things like that. And because it must not be uncomfortable or difficult, it absolutely should be easy, I'll put it off and do something that is easy or uncomplicated. So that's what causes procrastination. And then the solution, as I mentioned, is to ask yourself for the evidence for that statement. What is the evidence? Where is it written? Why must I avoid discomfort? Why must everything in my life be interesting, easy, and hassle-free? And normally the answer is there's no reason I have to avoid difficulty. In fact, if I procrastinate on difficult tasks, then usually I'm creating more difficulty for myself in the long run. It's hanging over my head. I may never get around to it. I'm preoccupied with it, as was pointed out. So the musts don't work and lead to procrastination. While we're talking about the third must, a demand on the conditions of one's life, one of the main outcomes of this must, life must be fair, easy, and hassle-free, consists of addictions. Addictions to alcohol, drugs, gambling, compulsive shopping, love and sex addictions, a whole host of addictions. And one way to think of this is escapism. Most addictions are a form of escaping from the present moment, the discomfort in the present moment, whether it's in internal discomfort, such as an urge to have a drink, or a craving for a drink, or an external discomfort. I just got fired from a job, or I was criticized by my partner. It normally takes the form of, because I prefer not to face this discomfort or this frustration right now, I absolutely must, so I'll have another drink, or I'll have another smoke, or I'll get high. So that's often where addictions come from. Okay, other questions? Yes.
Well, yeah, also I wanted to say about procrastination. I had a business for 25 years, and I found it a very useful tool. A lot of problems got solved when, by themselves, they didn't need me to be involved. And, anyway, my question, if I can, on your must, how much is the subconscious or the early imprinting play into this, if any at all?
Okay, that's a good question. By the way, you made two good points. The first one is, sometimes if you put something off, then it might get solved or done by itself. So that's part of evaluating the pluses and minuses of putting something off. Is it possible, or is there a good chance it might get done itself? So I'll put it off. In that case, we would call that reasonable procrastination rather than unreasonable procrastination. Even though you might have done it for the wrong calculation,
you just have faith in your employees.
At the time, in terms of your thinking, it was unreasonable, but in terms of the long-term consequences, it worked out okay. And then you could use that information in the future to do the cost-benefit analysis of whether to put the same thing off in the future. And then the second question is a very good one and a basic one. Where do these musts and shoulds come from? If we all have them in some areas of our life, which is the case I'm making, why is that? Does it come from our childhood or other influences? And the evidence seems to be that adult personality, whether it's disturbance or other personality traits, mainly come from our genetic predispositions. And humans are rationalizing animals. We love to make up stories about why we are afraid of relationships, because when I was 3 years old, my mother criticized me and abused me, so that's why I'm afraid of relationships now. But that's really not a controlled study, because we don't know if you had a loving mother whether you would have been afraid of relationships now. And the evidence seems to be there's a good chance, not a certainty, but there's a good chance that you had some genetic predisposition to have these fears, or a combination of fears that led to this fear of intimacy or commitment, and that's a better explanation. And much of this reasoning comes from identical twin studies, where identical twins for some reason are separated at birth. They're raised in entirely different homes, and many of their personality traits, including emotional disturbance, are pretty close together. So it largely comes from our genetic predispositions, but because it does, that doesn't mean we're cooked. That doesn't mean we can't change our thinking now, because genetic predispositions are influences. They don't control us, and they're mediated by our thinking. So if we look into our thinking that's leading us to use this influence in a self-destructive way, then we can change that thinking and work against the genetic predispositions. For example, as I told you, I was depressed for much of my life till I was 19 and met Albert Ellis. I believe I was depressed because I had a genetic predisposition, still do, to be depressed. My mother was depressed all her life. Yet I changed my thinking dramatically as a result of learning a new way from Albert Ellis, and now I rarely get depressed, and when I do, I pretty easily identify the musts and shoulds, dispute them, do some cognitive exercises that I discuss in my book, 3-Minute Therapy, to change my thinking, reinforce that, and usually that works pretty well. Okay, there was another question here. Yes.
I'm wondering if your words must and demand are extreme, that I want to substitute the word wish for demand. And it seems to me that's important to occur, let's say in a couple, for them to express their wishes to each other.
Okay, that's an excellent question, which is, would it be better to express your wishes, not demands, musts and shoulds, especially in your relationship? Yes, excellent idea. So when I work with feuding couples, I teach them this lesson about musts and shoulds are causing their friction, at least their emotional disturbance and escalation about friction. And I show them how to get rid of their musts and shoulds, but strongly and firmly express their preferences. We don't want to go to the other extreme, and because it's not a must, it's not true that you have to treat me better, therefore it doesn't matter at all. That's the other extreme. Getting rid of must doesn't mean you lie down, you're a doormat, and you let everyone in the world walk all over you. Underneath musts and shoulds are your strong preferences. Demands come from escalating strong preferences into absolutes. So if you get rid of the absolute, you still have the strong preference underneath it. And then I teach various communication strategies people in relationships, either intimate relationships, work relationships, friendship relationships, can use to speak preferentially rather than musts and shoulds. And I often give them a formula. The formula is practice saying, I prefer X, how do you feel? Rather than, you should have done that, or you should do this, or you're no good, or for the last 50 years you've been doing X, Y, and Z, and I've been telling you you shouldn't. That's out the window. Just, I prefer you do X or don't do Y, how do you feel? Now the second part is very important. How do you feel? Because just because you express your preference doesn't mean it registers on the other person. They could be thinking what a rat you are for telling them that you have a different preference. So if you engage them by saying, how do you feel about my preference, then you can find out what their objections might be and work toward a solution.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah.
I think I'm a pretty rational person, and I'm pretty sure I know what I ought to be preferring to do. But how do you actually make yourself do it? You said you talk about it in your book. If I promise to consider buying your book, can you give us a little taste of some of these cognitive approaches?
Well, I'll give you a more complete taste of some of these approaches in my book, but I'd certainly be happy to give you a few now. And the question is, if you are procrastinating on something, are there any practical strategies you can use to make it less likely you'd procrastinate? And yes, there are many practical strategies. Let's suppose you're procrastinating on washing the dishes or cleaning the house or speaking to a friend about a problem you have in the relationship. One of the most powerful ways, if you're willing to use it, to give yourself an extra immediate incentive to do some of these unpleasant tasks, is first specifying exactly what you want to do. Immediately after dinner, I'm going to wash the dishes, or every day at 9 a.m., I'm going to spend 10 minutes cleaning my apartment. So you specify exactly what you want, and then you set up rewards for doing it and penalties for not doing it. So you have some reinforcers. And a reward would be something that you normally don't do, that you would enjoy doing, that would be an incentive, that you would levy immediately. You'd levy that reward immediately if you wash the dishes right after dinner. So it could be something like listening to a favorite CD, or watching a DVD, or taking yourself out to dinner, or going to a movie, or calling a friend that you would like to talk to, or reading, spending 15 minutes on the internet. So all these things could be rewards, and if you set that up, then that could be a motivator. Now, most of the time when I work with people who have a procrastination problem and I suggest the reward part of the reinforcement, they often say, well, anything I enjoy doing, I do anyway, so it's not going to be an extra incentive. So then we go to the dark side of the coin, which is the penalties. A penalty is anything you normally don't do that would be aversive, that you would not like doing, but you'd be willing to do, and you would immediate levy if you don't wash the dishes immediately after dinner. And a few of the nice things about setting a penalty is that possible penalties are practically infinite. We could probably go on and on coming up with things that you would prefer not to do that would be aversive in your life. But most of them you wouldn't want to do, and it wouldn't make sense to use that as a penalty because you're just not going to do it. But usually we can come up with things that you would be willing to do that would be aversive that you could apply immediately. And over the years I've had very creative clients who have come up with interesting penalties. I had one young man whose goal was who wanted to meet a woman, and his goal was to speak to 3 women a day anywhere that he didn't know, just start a conversation. And for every woman that day he didn't speak to, he would take 1 minute cold shower, ice cold shower. And that was a great incentive because he was willing to levy that penalty. If you're not willing to levy it, then it's not going to work. I had another client, actually in Peru, we did Skype sessions, and his life was a shambles because he was procrastinating on everything, on email, on work projects, on cleaning the house. And we experimented with various penalties, and we came up with one, and it was quite amazing. This dramatically changed his life. He stopped procrastinating because of this one penalty that he came up with, and that was he would write a detailed schedule for the day, and then any time he didn't, within 5 minutes of the time to start, he didn't start doing that, he would take 3 tablespoons of vinegar. And that worked miraculously for him. And once in a while, it was important, once in a while when he did screw up on the goal, he did swallow the vinegar, but most of the time he didn't. Now, after that, I suggested that to another client, and she said, oh, I like apple cider vinegar, so that's not going to work for me. So again, it's an individual thing. It means experimenting with various possible penalties. One of the best penalty is a money penalty, where you do something, you get rid of in some way a set amount of money. Now, it's a very good penalty because if penalizing yourself $100 for not immediately doing the dishes after eating is not going to work for you because you just can't afford to dispose of $100 like that, then we could try $50 or $10 or $1. I once had a client whose penalty was 25 cents each time he didn't do the apportion task, and just the 25 cents, not because it would make a dent in his bank account, it wouldn't, but it was a reminder that he had this to do, and he just didn't like the idea of penalizing himself at all. Just penalizing himself a quarter was effective in helping him. Then there's a question about what would you do with the money. So that there's a number of possibilities. You could rip it up, you could burn it. I had a client who gave up smoking because every time he took a puff of a cigarette, he was required to take a puff of a dollar bill. So that did it for him, even though it was just $1, but he was burning it. You could send it to your least favorite charity. So if you like the Democrats but not the Republicans, send the money to your least favorite Republican, or vice versa. I had one client who was an avowed atheist. He hated the Catholic Church, so he had a $10 penalty for not doing the assigned task, and when he didn't do the task, I suggested, well, send it to the Catholic Church. He gave me one better. He would deliver it in person to his neighborhood church. He'd give them $10 and say, this is for your great works, and that cured him. So the money penalty is very flexible and variable. Does that answer the question about using procrastination? Okay, we have another question here. Over here was first. Yeah.
Thank you. So, there are perfectly rationally thinking people who are still in a serious depression because their problem is not in thinking, but rather in perception. They just don't see anything positive in their life.
They don't, what was the last sentence? They don't what?
Don't see anything positive, anything good.
They don't see anything positive in their life.
And
right.
this perception, it can be like you said, genetically determined, but practically it can be because of brain chemistry, because of these neurotransmitters, this serotonin and so on. And so how is there any use in this rational thinking techniques for these cases, or it's only can be addressed by chemical, by drugs, by something?
Okay, very good question. And the question is, isn't it true that sometimes when people are depressed, anxious, angry, it's really determined by our brain chemistry, and therefore wouldn't drugs, medication be the appropriate treatment rather than changing your thinking? Now, it's my view that since we're biochemical animals, every feeling we have, everything we do, even every thought we have does have biochemical causes or influences in the brain. So not only do I think that deep depression or anxiety has our neurotransmitters screwed up some way, but any thought we have comes from, to some extent, influenced by our brain chemistry. So I don't see any reason why our non-functional brain chemistry is a reason why we can't intervene on the place of mediators, our thinking, to change things. Because remember, my brief for a genetic explanation of these problems was not our genetics control us, but our genetics influence us, and then our thinking tends to control us. The bottom line is our thought at the moment. So if someone has a very strong biochemical influence in terms of depression, as I believe I did, coming from a family that was partly depressed, it just means more work, more practice to change our thinking, rather than we're hopeless cases and we need medication. Similarly, if you think of analogy, it might explain that. Let's suppose you're tone deaf, but you'd like to learn, and you have no musical ability, poor at rhythm, and you'd like to learn to play the piano. Well, it would take more piano practice to learn to play some Mozart sonatas, but if you practice, then eventually you'd probably be able to do better than just banging on the piano. Or similarly with languages, if you have no natural linguistic ability, because of your genetic predispositions, not because that you learned English as a child, but because of your genetic predispositions, and you practice a certain language, take language immersion classes, go to the country where they speak this language, eventually you'll be able to speak in some intelligible way. Not necessarily fluently, without an American accent, but at least in order to communicate with the natives. So to the extent that your brain chemistry, neurotransmitters are off, that often tells you how hard and persistent it would mean to work to change your thinking, and it would probably mean you'll never be totally rational. I don't think there's ever been a human being who's been 100% totally rational, but still you can make great changes. I've worked, for example, with someone who had a diagnosis of a paranoid schizophrenic who claimed that the KGB was following him, and as a result of changing his thinking, the musts about the KGB. I must not be followed by them. I must not be disapproved by the KGB and others. I'm a worthless person. As a result of practicing some of these exercises on a regular basis, he didn't give up the idea that the KGB was following him, but he got dramatically less anxious about that. And after a series of hospitalizations, he went on, while I was working with him, with no more hospitalizations. And I've worked with another schizophrenic people who, when they work assiduously at these exercises, have been able to stay out of the hospital. Now, a word about the exercises. One of the main exercises, which I describe in my book, 3-Minute Therapy, I call a 3-minute exercise. And the 3-minute exercise consists of outlining your problem, the situation, your musts and shoulds, and then outlining a better way to think of it. So, for example, in terms of procrastination, we start with A, activating event. It's time to do, you would write at A, activating event, it's time to do the dishes and it would be uncomfortable. Then you write B, irrational belief, it must not be uncomfortable, it should be easy, so I'll put it off until tomorrow. And then now B leads to C, your undesirable behavior. It's not A, the unpleasant task that causes you to procrastinate, but B, your belief, your irrational belief, the must or should. It must be pleasant to wash the dishes that causes you procrastination. So at A, B, and C, we diagnose the problem. Then we go on to D, E, and F to develop a new perspective. D is the questioning process, disputing or questioning your irrational belief. What's the evidence? It must be pleasant, easy, fun to wash the dishes or do my homework. And then E, effective new thinking. The answer at E, you would write many reasons why that must is false, such as, although I prefer it be easy and enjoyable to do this task, there's no 11th commandment saying it absolutely must be fun and easy. It is unpleasant to do the dishes, but hardly awful, terrible, or horrible. I've survived doing unpleasant tasks in the past, and I'll survive this time. Although I don't like facing unpleasantness and difficulty, I definitely can stand, I can bear what I don't like. It's not the unpleasantness of the task that forces me to procrastinate, but rather it's my musty thinking about it that does me in. And with practice, reinforcement, repetition, I can change my thinking, and I can learn to unconditionally accept uncomfortable tasks and deal with them rather than running away from them, making my life worse. This lesson will benefit me for the rest of my life. So those are examples of some E's that you would put down when you're doing the 3-minute exercise, and then finally that would lead to F, a new feeling or behavior, in this case facing the task and doing it now rather than putting it off. So this pretty much outlines the process and outlines the whole theory. Where our dysfunctional behaviors and emotions come from B, and how we change it by abolishing the must and should, reinforcing the preferences at E, which will lead to F. So the more you practice, repeat that in writing on a regular basis, once a day, twice a day, 10 million times a day, the more you do that, the more you change your thinking, as long as what you're writing at E makes sense to you. If you write things that don't make sense, that you'd like to believe, such as every day in every way I'm getting better and better, and I'm God's gift to the human race, you can write that 1,000 times, especially if you're an atheist, and it's really not going to make any impression, fortunately. But if you write, I'm an imperfect human who acts imperfectly, not a worthless louse, hopefully that'll make sense to you. And the more you write that, the more you go over it, the more you change the neurotransmitters in your brain and develop an entirely new philosophy, must and free philosophy, without the demands that lead to these problems. Now, before I take the next question, since we're nearing the end, I just want to conclude with the final part, and then we'll take some more questions till 12:15, and that is, where does happiness and meaning come into all this? Now, normally, if you get rid of your musts and shoulds, the psychological blocks to demands, rather to happiness and meaningfulness, and you stop making these preferences into musts and shoulds, then you set goals, and normally if you've been alive for a few years, you have goals that keep you getting out of bed in the morning. You set goals and work toward the goals, and happiness is a byproduct of the process of working toward your goals, and then if you achieve your goals, it's a byproduct of feeling good about achieving your goals, which comes from preferences. I prefer to write the great American novel, and now that I have, that's good, that's great, that's wonderful. So you feel positive about what you do, not about your total self. Your total self is another total evaluation, which has no basis in reality. And then in terms of meaning, if you feel your life is devoid of meaning, there are many ways to introduce meaning into your life. One is look at things in the past you've enjoyed and try to really plunge into that, making it a big project. If you've enjoyed reading Shakespeare, for example, then the meaning in your life to become a great expert on Shakespeare and read everything he wrote, all the analysis of what he wrote, the analysis of whether he was the actual poet who wrote that. There are all kinds of debates about that, and become an expert on that. Or if you don't really know what you've enjoyed, or none of the things you've enjoyed in your life don't ring a bell in terms of something you really want to make a project, then experiment with various things and do research. Look at the internet, see what floats other people's boat, and experiment with those things. Ask friends, acquaintances, people that are passionate about things in life, and experiment with that. Albert Ellis would say humorously, if you like war, work for war, and if you like peace, work for peace. So develop passions, and that will give you pleasure and meaning in your life. Okay, we had some more questions. Yes?
Well, I have one comment and one question. I was teaching my daughter how to drive, and she kept not noticing stop signs and zooming right through them. And then when I said, hey, you missed a stop sign, that didn't seem to make her notice them. So finally I said, every time you stop at a stop sign, I'm giving you $0.25. And every time you miss a stop sign, I'm taking away 50 cents. And the maximum per drive is $5. Because I could see losing a lot of money on that. But anyway, that's did it, because all of a sudden it was worth her while to notice the stop signs. And hopefully she kept it up, you know?
Yeah.
And then the other question I have is, when you're talking about working with paranoid schizophrenics, I have a friend who became a paranoid schizophrenic. She's functional, except she believes that she's being stalked. And all kinds of fantasies arise out of that, total. And I don't think she would be willing to go for therapy because she thinks she's right. So
Okay.
how do you get them to go to therapy?
Right. You have some very good points there that I haven't elaborated on, which are important, and I would like to. And one is, suppose you have a friend, relative, acquaintance who clearly to you has severe problems in their life, and you think that this approach could help them, but they're unwilling to go for therapy. Now, the bottom line is you normally can't force someone to go to therapy. You can influence them in different ways, but normally you can't force someone to go to therapy. So if it's clear they're not going to go, you might as well stop beating your head against a brick wall and keep on nagging them. But some of the things you might do to influence them that could work is you could say, I read this great book called 3-Minute Therapy, and I really value your opinion. I wonder if you could give me your critique of this book. I'm probably missing something because I think it's so wonderful. I think it changed my life. Would you read the book and tell me where I'm off? So that might be one way with some people to introduce them to the ideas, and then maybe they could start thinking, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. It might even work for me. So that's one way to influence them. Another way you might influence them is using the method you used with your daughter and the stop signs. You could say, look, if you have one therapy session, then I will give you a quarter or maybe $250, depending on how difficult a customer you're working with. And if you don't, I won't speak to you for a month or something like that. Now that leads to your first point about the stop signs, and that is, I talked about how you can penalize yourself, but it's a little different in working with other people and using reinforcements with them. And although with oneself, normally penalties work better, with other people, often rewards work better. So it would be good to consider rewards, and it tends to work better if you come up with the rewards collaboratively, because you might think giving your daughter a quarter is a great reward, but she may not care at all, and she might prefer you taking her out to a meal or not bugging her for a month or something like that. So it's good if you can find out from the other person what would be rewarding. Now if they won't discuss it, then you can experiment. For 1 week, try giving them a quarter. For the next week, don't bug them. And for the next week, try something else, and you could see if anything works. Okay, thanks for the question.
Yes.
Yes?
I'm wondering whether selfish or sociopathic people seek treatment, and if so, how do you apply your principles to treat such behavior?
Question is if selfish or sociopathic people seek treatment, and not really in my experience. Normally, in my experience, people who seek treatment do care what influence or outcome their own behavior has on others, and that's a great motivator for them to come to therapy. And normally people who are selfish or totally self-absorbed think they're doing fine, and it's everyone else who needs therapy. So they're normally not good candidates for therapy, but if you are an acquaintance of someone or related to someone who's like this, you can try some of the strategies to get them to therapy that way. Now, sometimes someone might come to therapy who might be sort of in those categories, not in the extreme, because their parents said, you better go for therapy, and if you don't, I'm cutting off your allowance or something like that. So they come to me, and the adolescent says, I don't have any problems, it's my mother who thinks I have problems. So I say, well, as long as you're here, are there any things in your life that you'd like to achieve, that you'd like to accomplish, that you're not accomplishing, and I could help you do better at achieving this. So often this brings up issues such as my friends who I want to be friends with, they don't like me. It's not my fault, it's their fault. They don't understand what a great person I am. So then we discuss practical issues. Even though you think you're a great person, there's still things you can do to connect with other people, to have them like you more by looking from their perspective, doing things that they enjoy, etc. And sometimes this has some influence.
I was once seeing a therapist and a co-therapist, and they brought up the idea of my least favorite charity. And so I thought about it. I came back next week. I was thinking, well, maybe Jerry Falwell would be my least favorite charity. They both made a terrible face. And the idea was I would give the therapist a check, and if I didn't meet some deadline, then the check would go to the least favorite. I said, would you actually send the check? He says, yes, he would. Anyway, I didn't try that. But a little bit later, I tried something else, my favorite charity. And I talked to the president of my favorite charity, and we were discussing things that I was supposed to do, certain chores and so on, and I would procrastinate. And we made an agreement. I had deadlines. I had certain things to do, and I'd make a list of them with deadlines, and there'd be a price. You know, if I missed something, $5, $10, whatever. And so he was monitoring me. I have to report to him. Without that monitor, it didn't work. If it was just, it was really important to me because it was a, so I've tried it without the monitor. So it seems to me that, so there's two things. The importance of having a monitor, a report to the person, and favorite charity rather than least favorite charity. I didn't want to spend $1,000 even to my favorite charity. So that worked a lot better.
Yes, those are very good points in terms of other ways you can try reinforcement. Give the money to your favorite charity as a reward rather than your least favorite charity as a penalty. Or sometimes I've had clients who, as a penalty, they gave their money to their favorite charity, and the reason it was a penalty, they just felt they couldn't afford to do it, so it's a penalty, but it wasn't so aversive as to give it to their least favorite charity, so at least they were willing to do it and felt that they had incurred a penalty. And in terms of reporting to others, another excellent suggestion that works with some people some of the time, which is report to others. Tell your friend, every night I'm going to send you an email telling you whether or not I studied French for 15 minutes today. And with some people, just that accountability, as you're saying, does a great job as a reinforcer, both negative and positive. I wanted to make another important point before we close about this approach, and that is I'll have clients in early sessions who will tell me, you know, everything you say makes sense. It's perfectly reasonable. Get rid of my musts and shoulds. So I recognize what you're saying, yet nothing's changed. I'm still just as crazy as I was before I came here. And that leads to understanding how this process works, and it works on two levels, what I call level 1 thinking and level 2 thinking. Level 1 thinking is a superficial recognition, like this client demonstrated, that your musts and shoulds are false, there's no evidence for them, they're fictions, like Santa Claus, but that's not going to change much. What's going to change is walking the bridge from level 1 to level 2 thinking. Level 2 thinking is where you've deeply internalized this new way of thinking that all musts and shoulds are false, preferences make sense but not demands. Recognizing that on a deep level, internalizing it, feeling it and acting on it, making it an entirely new way of looking at things without musts, without shoulds, just with strong preferences. And the way to get from level 1 to level 2, from a superficial recognition to a deep conviction, is by using the same learning principle we use to learn most things, and that says reinforcement is the royal road to learning. The more we practice, the more we reinforce something that makes sense, the more we get it into our skull. Okay, we have time for one last question.
Actually, I've just been told lunch is ready and it's 12:15. So.
Okay, we have no time for any last questions, but actually we do, because I'll be having lunch here, so feel free to ask me any of your questions. They've been great questions, and if you'd like to purchase my book, 3-Minute Therapy, I have some copies here as well. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you.